Hello, and welcome to this installation of our plant engineering video conversation. I'm your host, Amara Rozgus, editor-in-chief of Plant Engineering, and I've connected with Greg Schinkel from Unique Training and Development. We're going to talk about workforce development and the many topics that surround it. Thanks for joining me, Greg.
Hey, Amar, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, and here's some background so you know who Greg is. Greg Schinkel is president of Unique Training and Development. You can find him at www.uniquedevelopment.com, which trains frontline supervisors, managers, and team leads in manufacturing and operations environments. Greg advises organizations on how to develop high-performance cultures specific to each organization. And the workforce is shifting. We all know that, both from the many retirements and from artificial intelligence. So we have a lot to talk about, Greg. So starting at the top, how is the manufacturing workforce changing and what shift concerns plant leaders the most?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Amara. I think there really is two main changes that we're looking at in production facilities, plant and production facilities. The first is that the workers that are coming in these days, the newer and younger workers, are not the typical workers that factories would have seen joining them in decades past. So they're not used to the environment, the working conditions, sometimes the difficulty of work. And that's going to be a special challenge that we're going to talk about a little bit more in terms of how to get those younger workers to fit into the production environment and stick with the organization. The second big change that I see is that the plant managers, who again typically come up either from the engineering stream or they come up through the production and operations stream, they're struggling with how to get to be more strategic and overcome these gaps and overlaps that exist in accountability within their management team.
Okay. And you just touched on this a tiny bit. How are baby boomer retirements affecting plant operations, the O&M team? And how is the transfer of institutional knowledge going?
Yeah, it's still a struggle that we're seeing in a number of our clients, Amara, because really when you think about it, if I have this giant gap of experience, I can't count on people having enough runway to get up to speed in all the things that we need them to do and do well. So companies are looking at having to make an additional investment, which no production facility wants more indirect labor cost, but we really don't have a choice but to use some indirect labor to overlap people so that younger and newer employees can really benefit from the skills and experience that the more seasoned workers have. I think that the other thing we're looking at is that companies who probably never consider themselves to be in the training business actually need to be thinking about being in the training business. They need to figure that they have to develop the younger talent that they have in the organization in order for those people to be both productive and also to stick with the organization long enough to become more efficient.
So then, Greg, how should plants rethink training so that it better reflects the realities of modern manufacturing environments?
Yeah, no, it's a good thing, and we see that both folks who are in the HR world or the learning and development world, along with those who are more in the operations focus, what they're recognizing is that we can't have more abstract onboarding or abstract training on concepts. We need people to get hands-on learning labs inside the business, and that means that the training of these new and younger workers needs to occur from either operations people doing some of the training themselves, or at least be heavily involved in designing the training processes.
So then, where's the biggest disconnect between what new workers are taught and what industrial facilities actually need on the job?
Yeah, so I think the challenge has been that traditional onboarding is usually a very concentrated 1 or 2 or 3 days worth of training, and it's mostly focused on safety and overall company policies and HR policies. And what we're seeing is that the more proactive companies are actually setting up, again, these learning labs inside the business where they're teaching people some very basic things like how to use hand tools, how to use measuring tapes and measuring devices like verniers and micrometers. And they're recognizing that you can't assume that anyone has ever experienced using hand tools these days. I mean, every plant manager dreams of hiring kids that grew up on a farm doing chores and working on tractors and equipment. But the reality is that the farm kids population is not big enough to serve all the manufacturing plants. So we basically have to supplement or replace that training that people might have had doing other jobs when they were growing up, because they're often coming into factories never having done that type of work before.
Right, right. So it sounds like there are a lot of different approaches. So what training approaches are proving most effective for these frontline workers? And especially when you're talking about a fast-paced plant environment, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think it's great for learning and development, HR and plant and operations folks to think through what is it that I need people to learn. So I need it to be hands-on. Usually the employees who are interested in working in a production environment are already kind of kinesthetic type learners to begin with. So they're not going to learn as much from conceptual, watching PowerPoints or videos. They need to be hands-on. And so the training actually has to be very active learning oriented. And that the best way to do that, since the factory is usually full of hands-on, work, is to create the training to be hands-on and very practical for people. So let's not just tell them what they're going to do. Let's have them actually doing it while they're receiving good, solid feedback from people who are experts in doing those tasks. It'll build up the confidence of those no workers so they can become more productive, do the work better and safer.
Now, Greg, somebody has to lead these teams. So what leadership qualities are the most important for supervisors or managers, people who are leading multi-generational manufacturing teams?
Yeah, I think, on one hand, the universal needs of especially frontline leaders, which is one of the groups that we work with, especially in manufacturing, is it's usually going to boil down to three main topics. One is going to be communication skills, because that is basically the transmission between what's going on in your mind and what you need people to do. And in the book that we wrote, that my dad and I wrote, which is, I know it's on the bookshelf here, but let me just hold it up here, Employees Not Doing What You Expect. You can imagine that the number one reason that people don't meet expectations is because they don't know what the expectations are. So having the leaders communicate effectively, having the leaders be good at giving feedback, and not in a gruff or demeaning or abrasive way, but in a constructive way. And then how to manage the inevitable conflicts and disagreements that can happen in a production environment to get people on the same page. So the one thing that we didn't talk about, which is more emotional intelligence, I would say that leaders need to master the art of empathy, and that is the ability to meet the new workers where they are so that they feel that the leaders are on their side and are there to commit to them being successful in the long run.
Okay. Okay. And another thing that interests me, at least, is cross training. What does cross training look like? How does it help improve resilience or flexibility or even productivity?
Right. Well, of course, the key word these days, Amara, is agility. So in order to have agility in your workforce, because the days of being able to absolutely plan out your production, know exactly what your volumes are going to be or your production mix, it's a lost art these days. It's not going to happen. What we have to do is get a workforce who can flow to the work. And the only way you can get your workforce to flow to the work is to have them be cross-trained. Now, one of our clients, I think, took a really great strategy to accomplishing this. They had what they called a 3x3x3 cross-training system. That is that every job on the floor needs to have three people qualified to do that job, that every person needs to be qualified on at least three jobs or three different machines or work centers. And finally, those people need to be able to perform at that job at least a level 3 out of a 4-level system. The fourth level, by the way, would be able to train other people to do the job, but they have to at least be able to work self-sufficiently at that. So again, going back to our theme that we talked about earlier, is that the leaders need to actually create the time and space for their workers to get this cross-training, because that's the only way you're going to have this very fluid work group able to flow to the work.
All right, Greg, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball here and look into the future. What will separate manufacturers that build strong, sustainable workforces from those that struggle with the hiring and the training and the retention?
Yeah. So the reality is it still comes down to primarily two things, Amara. I think the first thing is to recognize this is a leadership challenge. So it's probably not that surprising to your listeners and viewers to know that companies spend more time training up a new employee than they do a new supervisor. So we end up promoting all these people from within, and we don't really give them much training. I think the one study I saw said that on average, a leader goes about 13 years before they get their first leadership training. So many of them are kind of stumbling and fumbling. And you can imagine while that's going on, workers are saying, I don't want to work, like worker expectations, I think have never been higher. What they will put up with is at an all-time low. So companies have to step up their leadership game. I think the second part, Amara, is really around operational standardization. This isn't new for companies that are looking at lean and continuous improvement, and they're probably creating lots of different standard work. But we need to look at the operational processes to standardize them. I still feel that most companies, even the ones who tout their lean and continuous improvement initiatives, are still only accomplishing maybe 15 to 20% of the possible outcomes they could be getting from lean. And so focusing on the two things, the human capital through leadership and development, and then the operational standardization, I think is going to be key to success.
Well, that really gives operations teams a lot to think about. Thank you so much, Greg.
Yeah, hey, it's been my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, that was Greg Schinkel from Unique Training and Development talking about several aspects of education and training. For more information on continuing education and other workforce development topics, please visit Plant Engineering at www.plantengineering.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and goodbye.